There is a place on the east bank of the Nile, in what is now the Egyptian city of Luxor, where 30 pharaohs built upon the work of their predecessors for 2,000 consecutive years. Not 30 pharaohs working independently, 30 pharaohs adding, stone upon stone, pylon upon pylon, column upon column, to a single complex that grew, generation after generation, into the largest religious site ever constructed by human hands. The result covers more than 200 acres. It contains temples, chapels, obelisks, colossal statues, sacred lakes, ceremonial avenues, and a forest of stone columns so dense that standing inside it feels less like entering a building and more like being swallowed by a geological formation. This place is Karnak, and nothing else in the ancient world, nothing in Greece, nothing in Rome, nothing in Mesopotamia, nothing in the Americas, comes close. The numbers alone are staggering. The Great Hypostyle Hall, just one room within the complex, covers 5,000 square meters and contains 134 stone columns, 12 of which stand 21 meters tall and are so massive that it would take 6 adults linking arms to encircle a single one. The complex includes 10 pylons, monumental gateways, each one larger than most Egyptian temples, arranged along 2 intersecting axes that stretch for hundreds of meters. The sacred lake, an artificial reservoir used for ritual purification, covers more than 2.5 acres. And in 1903, a French archaeologist named Georges Legrain, digging in a courtyard in front of the 7th pylon, discovered a buried cache containing more than 700 stone statues and 17,000 bronze figurines, the largest hoard of Egyptian statuary ever found, hidden beneath the temple pavement by priests who were trying to save the gods from destruction. But the numbers, impressive as they are, miss the point. Karnak is not a monument, it is a process. It is 2,000 years of continuous construction, compressed into a single site, a living document of Egyptian civilization, written in stone, with each pharaoh adding a chapter, and no pharaoh erasing the ones that came before. Walk through Karnak from west to east, and you walk through time. From the Ptolemaic additions of the 3rd century BC, through the New Kingdom constructions of Ramesses and Hatshepsut and Thutmose, back to the Middle Kingdom foundations laid by Senusret I around 1970 BC. The temple does not merely contain history. The temple is history, architectural history, religious history, political history, all layered on top of each other, inseparable from each other, readable in the stone if you know how to look. And it gets worse, or rather more extraordinary. A study published in January of 2026 proposed that the earliest foundations of Karnak may have been deliberately placed on land that emerged from water, mimicking the Egyptian creation myth in which the first solid ground rose from the primordial waters of chaos. If this theory is correct, then Karnak is not just a temple complex, it is a recreation of the creation itself. The first mound of earth, the first act of order imposed on chaos, the birthplace of the universe, rebuilt in stone on the banks of the Nile. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand how Karnak was built, why it grew for 20 centuries, what it meant to the people who worshipped there, and why its eventual abandonment tells us as much about the fragility of civilization as its construction tells us about human ambition. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. Consider for a moment what it means to build on the same site for 2,000 years. The earliest known structures at Karnak date to roughly 2055 BC, during the Middle Kingdom. The last significant additions were made during the Roman period, around the 1st century of the Common Era. That is a span of construction that dwarfs any other religious project in human history. The great cathedrals of medieval Europe, Notre Dame, Chartres, Cologne, took between 1 and 6 centuries to complete. Angkor Wat took roughly 40 years. The Parthenon took 15. Karnak took 2 millennia. And unlike the cathedrals, which were designed to a single plan and built toward a predetermined final form, Karnak was never finished. Each pharaoh expanded it according to their own vision, their own resources, their own theological priorities. The complex grew organically, like a coral reef, each generation adding its layer, the cumulative effect greater than any individual contribution. And within those walls, Karnak was not merely a temple, it was an economy. It owned vast agricultural estates across Upper Egypt. It employed thousands of priests, scribes, craftsmen, and laborers. It collected taxes, managed grain stores, and distributed food. It was, at its peak, the wealthiest institution in ancient Egypt, wealthier than the royal treasury itself. The priests of Amun, who administered this wealth, became so powerful that they rivaled the pharaohs. By the end of the New Kingdom, the high priest of Amun at Karnak was effectively the ruler of Upper Egypt, a theocratic monarch in all but name, governing from the temple that had made his office the most powerful in the land. That transfer of power, from pharaoh to priest, from palace to temple, is one of the most significant political stories in ancient history, and it played out, stone by stone, pylon by pylon, within the walls of Karnak. The temple that the pharaohs built to honor the gods became the temple that the gods used to outgrow the pharaohs. And the story of that transformation is written in the architecture itself, in the ever larger pylons, the ever more elaborate halls, the ever-expanding precincts that turned Karnak from a modest shrine into the religious capital of the ancient world. To understand Karnak, begin with the god it was built for, Amun. In the earliest periods of Egyptian religion, Amun was a minor local deity, one of 8 primordial gods in the Ogdoad of Hermopolis, associated with hidden forces and invisible winds. His name means the hidden one. He had no great temple, he had no great cult. He was, by the standards of the Egyptian pantheon, obscure. But when the 11th dynasty kings of Thebes, the city that would become the modern Luxor, unified Egypt and established Thebes as the new capital around 2061 BC, they brought their local god with them. Amun became the state god, and as the state grew more powerful, Amun grew more powerful with it. By the time of the 12th dynasty, Amun had been merged with Ra, the ancient sun god, the most powerful deity in the Egyptian tradition, to become Amun-Ra, king of the gods. This merger was not merely theological, it was political. By linking the local god of Thebes with the supreme solar deity of Egypt, the Theban kings claimed cosmic authority for their rule. Their god was not just a regional patron, their god was the sun itself. And the temple they built for him, at Karnak, on the east bank of the Nile, facing the rising sun, was the house where that cosmic authority resided. The earliest structures at Karnak were modest. Senusret I of the 12th dynasty built a small limestone chapel, the White Chapel, as it is now known. That is one of the finest pieces of Middle Kingdom architecture to survive. The chapel, which was later dismantled and its blocks reused as fill inside a later pylon, was reconstructed in the 20th century from its recovered fragments. It is a simple structure, a raised platform surrounded by pillars, decorated with precisely carved reliefs showing the king being embraced by Amun. The reliefs are exquisite. The scale is intimate. This is the seed from which Karnak grew. But the seed was planted in rich soil. Thebes occupied a strategic position on the Nile, close to the gold mines of Nubia, close to the trade routes that brought incense, ivory, and exotic goods from the south, and positioned at the boundary between Upper and Lower Egypt. The wealth that flowed through Thebes funded the temple, and the temple, in turn, became the institution through which that wealth was managed, distributed, and sanctified. The New Kingdom, the period from roughly 1550 to 1070 BC, was Karnak's golden age. This was the era of Egypt's greatest military expansion, when pharaohs like Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, and Ramesses II built an empire that stretched from the Euphrates River in modern Syria to the fourth cataract of the Nile in modern Sudan. The wealth that poured into Egypt from conquered territories and trade networks was staggering, and a significant portion of that wealth was channeled into Karnak. Thutmose III, the pharaoh who is sometimes called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt for his military campaigns, was the most prolific builder at Karnak after Ramesses II. He erected the 7th pylon, the 8th pylon, and the festival hall, a unique structure designed for the celebration of the Hebsed Jubilee, with columns carved to resemble tent poles, as if the stone hall were a permanent version of a temporary festival pavilion. He also built the Botanical Garden, a small room within the festival hall, whose walls are carved with images of plants and animals that Thutmose claimed to have encountered during his campaigns in Syria and Palestine. The room is, in effect, a scientific catalogue, a carved inventory of foreign flora and fauna produced by a military commander who was also, apparently, a naturalist. Thutmose also erected 2 obelisks at Karnak, towering granite needles, each carved from a single block of Aswan granite and transported more than 200 kilometers downriver to Thebes. The obelisks were symbols of the sun god, solid beams of sunlight frozen in stone, placed at the entrance to the temple to catch the first rays of dawn. One of Thutmose's obelisks was later transported to Constantinople by the Roman Emperor Theodosius in the 4th century of the Common Era. It still stands in the Hippodrome of Istanbul, a piece of Karnak, displaced by 3,000 years and 2,000 kilometers, still pointing at the sky. But the most famous builder at Karnak was not Thutmose. It was Seti I and his son, Ramesses II, the 2 pharaohs responsible for the Great Hypostyle Hall, the single most impressive interior space in the ancient world. The hall was constructed between the 2nd and 3rd pylons, filling a space that had previously been an open courtyard. The project was begun by Seti I and completed, and extensively claimed by Ramesses II. 134 columns arranged in 16 rows, supporting a roof that has long since collapsed, but that would have created an enclosed space of almost total darkness. The 12 central columns lining the main processional axis are the largest, 21 meters tall, with open papyrus capitals 5.5 meters in diameter. The remaining 122 columns flanking the central aisle are shorter, roughly 15 meters tall, with closed papyrus bud capitals. The height difference between the central and side columns created a clerestory, a row of stone lattice windows near the top of the central aisle that admitted narrow beams of light into the otherwise dark interior. Imagine it, a hall the size of a football pitch, columns so thick that 6 people cannot encircle one, a roof so high that the tallest column could hold a 7-story building, and darkness, near total darkness, pierced by thin blades of sunlight, filtering through the clerestory windows, illuminating ribbons of carved and painted stone while leaving the rest in shadow. The effect was deliberately overwhelming. The hall was not designed for comfort, it was designed for awe. It was the antechamber to the sanctuary of Amun-Ra, the room through which priests passed, in torchlit procession, carrying the sacred bark of the god on their shoulders, chanting hymns that echoed between the columns and disappeared into the darkness above. The walls of the Hypostyle Hall are covered with carved reliefs, military scenes on the exterior, religious scenes on the interior. The northern exterior wall depicts the campaigns of Seti I in Syria and Palestine, chariots charging, enemies falling, the king triumphant. The southern exterior wall records the campaigns of Ramesses II, including references to the famous Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites and the text of the peace treaty that followed, the earliest known peace treaty in world history, signed in the 21st year of Ramesses' reign. That treaty, carved in stone on the wall of a temple in Upper Egypt, is now recognized by the United Nations as a founding document in the history of diplomacy. A copy of it hangs in the UN headquarters in New York. The interior reliefs are different, ritual scenes showing the king in communion with the gods, offering incense, pouring libations, receiving divine blessing. These scenes were not meant for public display. They were meant for the priests who performed the daily rituals within the hall. The men who entered the darkness each morning, lit the torches, opened the shrine, and awakened the god. The reliefs were their script, their guide, their liturgical manual, carved in stone, permanent and unchangeable. And the construction of the hall itself was an act of devotion that approached the industrial. The sandstone blocks, each weighing several tons, were quarried at Gebel el-Silsila, roughly 150 kilometers south of Karnak, and transported by barge up the Nile. The columns were assembled from stacked drums of stone, each drum cut and fitted with precision before being raised into position. The architraves, the horizontal beams that spanned the tops of the columns and supported the roof, weighed up to 70 tons each. Raising them into position, more than 20 meters above the floor, required engineering expertise of the highest order, ramps, levers, and the coordinated labor of hundreds of workers. And yet the construction was not merely functional, it was symbolic. The columns were shaped like papyrus plants. The 12 central columns with open capitals representing papyrus in bloom. The side columns with closed bud capitals representing papyrus before flowering. The hall was a stone marsh, a recreation of the primordial swamp from which, in Egyptian mythology, the first land had risen at the moment of creation. The floor of the hall represented the waters of chaos. The columns represented the vegetation that grew from those waters. The ceiling, painted with golden stars on a blue background, represented the sky. And above it all, invisible and omnipresent, was the god Amun-Ra, the hidden one, the creator, the lord of Karnak. The Hypostyle Hall was theology in architecture. Every element had meaning, every surface carried a message, and every message reinforced the same central claim, that Karnak was not merely a temple. It was the center of the universe, the place where creation had occurred, the point where heaven and earth met, the home of the king of the gods. And the pharaoh who built within its walls was not merely a king. He was the chosen instrument of divine will, the son of Amun-Ra, ruling on earth as his father ruled in heaven. But Seti and Rameses were not the only pharaohs who left their mark on Karnak. The complex is a palimpsest of royal ambition, each generation writing over, building upon, and competing with the last. Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, who ruled for roughly 20 years in the 15th century BC, was one of Karnak's most ambitious builders. She erected 2 granite obelisks within the temple, each nearly 30 meters tall, cut from single blocks of red Aswan granite, the tallest obelisks at Karnak and among the tallest in Egypt. One of them still stands today, the tallest surviving ancient obelisk in the world, its tip capped with electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver that would have caught the morning sun and blazed like a torch above the temple. Hatshepsut inscribed the obelisk with a text that is both boastful and defensive. Now my heart turns this way and that, as I think what the people will say, those who shall see my monuments in years to come, and who shall speak of what I have done. That anxiety, the worry that future generations would question a woman's right to build at Karnak, proved prescient. After Hatshepsut's death, her stepson and successor, Thutmose III, ordered her name chiseled from many of her monuments. But at Karnak, he adopted a subtler approach. Rather than destroy her obelisks, which would have been a colossal engineering challenge in itself, he simply enclosed them within a new masonry structure, hiding the lower portions behind stone walls, while leaving the tips visible above. The obelisks were not removed, they were concealed, and the concealment paradoxically protected them from further damage. The sections hidden behind the walls retained their inscriptions in pristine condition, preserved by the very structure that was meant to erase them. Hatshepsut's words survived because her enemy chose concealment over destruction. Amenhotep III, who ruled roughly a century after Hatshepsut, added his own contributions, including a massive pylon and portions of the Mute precinct to the south. His architect, Amenhotep son of Hapu, was so revered that he was later deified, one of only a handful of non-royal Egyptians to receive that honor. Amenhotep III's building program at Karnak was part of a broader campaign that included the construction of the Luxor Temple, roughly 3 kilometers to the south, and the Colossi of Memnon on the west bank. The wealth of his reign, derived from Nubian gold, Asian trade, and diplomatic gifts, made him one of the greatest patron builders in Egyptian history. And then there was Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who attempted to abolish the worship of Amun entirely and replace it with the exclusive worship of the Aten, the sun disk. Akhenaten's revolution, which lasted roughly 17 years in the mid-14th century BC, struck directly at the heart of Karnak's power. The temples of Amun were closed. The priests were dismissed. The name of Amun was chiseled from monuments across Egypt, and at Karnak itself, Akhenaten built a new temple, the Jempa Aten, or the Aten is found, dedicated to his new god, using a revolutionary building technique, small, standardized blocks called talatat that could be carried by a single worker and assembled quickly. But Akhenaten's revolution did not last. After his death, his successors restored the worship of Amun, demolished the Aten temple at Karnak, and used the talatat blocks as fill for new pylons. More than 100,000 talatat blocks have been recovered from the fill of later structures at Karnak. The dismembered body of a heretical temple recycled into the foundations of an orthodox one. The blocks, many still bearing painted scenes and inscriptions from Akhenaten's reign, are now one of the most important sources for understanding the Amarna period. They were meant to be buried. They were meant to be forgotten. Instead, they were preserved by the very structures that were built to erase them. This pattern of building, erasure, and accidental preservation runs through the entire history of Karnak. Every pharaoh who built at the temple was simultaneously preserving some of their predecessors' work and destroying other parts of it. Blocks were reused, statues were reassigned, names were chiseled off and replaced, obelisks were concealed, temples were dismantled and rebuilt. The complex is a layered archaeological site in which each stratum tells a different story, and the stories sometimes contradict each other. Navigating this labyrinth of overlapping construction phases is the work of generations of archaeologists. The Centre Franco-Egyptien d'études des Temples de Karnak, the joint French-Egyptian mission that has been working at the site since 1967, has spent more than 5 decades documenting, mapping, and conserving the complex. Their work, combined with that of earlier excavators and more recent international teams, has produced a detailed, chronological framework for Karnak's construction. But even this framework is incomplete. New discoveries continue to emerge. New blocks are found in unexpected places. New inscriptions alter the dating of structures that were thought to be well understood. As recently as March of 2025, archaeologists working near the sanctuary area discovered gold jewellery hidden in a small chamber. Jewellery dating to the 22nd dynasty that likely belonged to a priestess of Amun. This is not the kind of discovery that makes headlines for its monetary value, although the objects are beautiful. It is significant because it demonstrates that Karnak still contains intact deposits, sealed spaces that have not been opened since antiquity. The temple has been excavated for more than a century and a half. It has been studied by hundreds of scholars, and it is still producing surprises. The Avenue of Sphinxes deserves special attention. This processional road, nearly 3 kilometers long, lined on both sides with hundreds of ram-headed and human-headed sphinxes, connected Karnak to the Luxor temple to the south. The avenue was built in stages, with sections dating from the 18th dynasty to the 30th dynasty, but its final form was completed under Nectanebo I, one of the last native Egyptian pharaohs, in the 4th century BC. The avenue was not simply a road. It was a liturgical pathway, the route along which the sacred bark of Amun was carried during the annual Opet festival, when the god travelled from Karnak to Luxor temple to renew the king's divine power. The Opet festival was the most important religious event in the Theban calendar. It lasted for several weeks. The golden bark of Amun, covered in precious metals and carried by dozens of priests, was processed from the sanctuary of Karnak along the avenue, flanked by musicians, dancers, soldiers, and thousands of spectators. At Luxor temple, the bark was placed in the inner sanctuary, where rituals were performed to renew the covenant between the king and the god. Then the bark was returned to Karnak, and the festival ended. The entire population of Thebes participated. It was the Super Bowl, the coronation, and the Easter procession combined. The annual demonstration that Egypt was still blessed, still orderly, still under divine protection. The avenue itself had been buried for centuries under later construction, silt, and modern development. Excavation and restoration, conducted over several decades by the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities, resulted in the reopening of the avenue to the public in 2021. Entire blocks of modern housing and a church were relocated to clear the ancient route. The restored avenue, now open for the first time in 2 millennia, allows visitors to walk the same processional path that the priests of Amun walked 3,000 years ago, from the first pylon of Karnak to the forecourt of Luxor temple, under the gaze of hundreds of stone sphinxes. The scale of the Karnak complex makes it unique, but the uniqueness is not merely physical, it is institutional. Karnak was not just the largest temple in Egypt, it was the administrative headquarters of Egyptian religion, the Vatican of the ancient world. The high priest of Amun at Karnak held a title, First Prophet of Amun, that carried political, economic, and military authority. He controlled the temple estates, the priestly hierarchy, and the theological interpretation of state religion. He was, in every practical sense, the second most powerful person in Egypt, and at certain points in Egyptian history, he was the most powerful person in Egypt. During the late 20th dynasty, the high priest Herihor claimed royal titles and depicted himself at equal scale with the pharaoh on the walls of Karnak, an act of theological audacity that would have been unthinkable a few centuries earlier. Herihor's assumption of royal prerogatives marked the effective end of unified pharaonic rule in Egypt and the beginning of the Third Intermediate Period, an era of division in which the priests of Amun at Karnak ruled Upper Egypt while a separate dynasty ruled Lower Egypt from the Delta. Karnak was the institution that made this division possible. The temple's wealth, its land, its grain, its gold, its political influence, was sufficient to sustain an independent government in Upper Egypt without royal support. The temple had outgrown the state, the servant had outgrown the master, and the pharaohs whose ancestors had built Karnak to legitimize their rule found themselves replaced by the priests of the god they had created. And Karnak's influence extended far beyond Egypt. The temple's reputation in the ancient world was comparable to that of the Parthenon in Athens or the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. Greek and Roman writers, including Herodotus and Strabo, described Karnak with a mixture of awe and incredulity. Herodotus, visiting Egypt in the 5th century BC, described the temple at Thebes as the most magnificent he had ever seen. Strabo, writing 4 centuries later, noted the scale of the complex and the beauty of its decorated surfaces. The Greeks, who prided themselves on the elegance of their architecture, were humbled by the sheer mass of Karnak, a temple that made the Parthenon look like a garden shed. Alexander the Great, when he conquered Egypt in 332 BC, made a point of visiting Karnak and presenting himself to the priests as the legitimate heir of the pharaohs. His successor, Ptolemy, adopted the Egyptian title Son of Amun and continued to build at Karnak, adding a gateway to the Temple of Khonsu and renovating portions of the main sanctuary. The Ptolemies understood what every pharaoh before them had understood, that Karnak was the key to Egyptian legitimacy. Control Karnak and you controlled the spiritual heart of the country. Lose Karnak and you lost the claim to rule. This principle held true for 2,000 years, from the first Theban pharaoh who elevated Amun to the last Ptolemaic king who made offerings at the temple. For 20 consecutive centuries, every ruler of Egypt who claimed legitimacy sought the endorsement of the god who lived at Karnak. The temple was not merely a religious institution. It was a king-making machine, a place where legitimacy was manufactured, certified, and displayed. And the architecture of the temple, the ever-growing pylons, the ever-taller obelisks, the ever more elaborate halls, was the physical record of that manufacturing process. Each pylon was a king's signature, each obelisk was a king's claim, each relief was a king's propaganda, and together, accumulated over 2 millennia, they formed the most comprehensive political archive in the ancient world, a record of kingship written in stone, spanning 30 reigns, recording victories and defeats, alliances and conquests, theological innovations, and political compromises. Karnak is not just a temple, it is a library written in architecture, catalogued in chronological order, shelved on the walls of the largest religious complex in history. And among the most remarkable recent findings is the geoarchaeological study published in 2026, suggesting that Karnak's earliest sanctuary was deliberately sited on a sandy island that seasonally emerged from the Nile floodwaters, a physical reenactment of the Egyptian creation myth in which the primeval mound rose from the waters of chaos at the beginning of time. Core samples taken beneath the temple foundations revealed layers of river sand and silt, consistent with a low-lying island that would have been exposed during the annual flood recession. If the theory is correct, the first builders of Karnak chose their site not for practical reasons. The island would have been inconvenient, requiring constant flood management, but for theological ones. They wanted to build on the first land, the land where creation began, the land that emerged from the water at the dawn of the world. This finding, if confirmed by further excavation, would transform our understanding of Karnak's origins. It would mean that the temple was not simply built on available high ground, as most Egyptian temples were. It was built on sacred ground, ground that physically enacted the creation myth, ground that was literally the primeval mound, ground that the builders believed was the oldest land on earth. The theology was not layered onto the architecture. The architecture was layered onto the theology. The land came first, the belief came first, and the temple, 2,000 years of construction, 200 acres of stone, was the expression of that belief, built on the spot where the Egyptians believed existence itself had begun. The central paradox of Karnak is this: the temple that was built to ensure cosmic order became the instrument of political disorder. The institution that was created to serve the pharaoh became the institution that replaced him. And the god who was elevated to king of the gods by royal decree eventually produced a priesthood that was more powerful than any king. This paradox is not accidental. It is structural, built into the very nature of Egyptian temple economics. Every pharaoh who built at Karnak did two things simultaneously. First, they enlarged the temple's physical footprint, adding pylons, halls, obelisks, and statues that proclaimed their devotion and their power. Second, they enlarged the temple's economic base, donating agricultural land, assigning tax revenues, and granting privileges that increased the temple's wealth and administrative capacity. Each donation was permanent. Each grant was irrevocable. The land given to Amun did not return to the crown when the pharaoh died. It remained with the temple, and the next pharaoh, seeking to outdo their predecessor, donated more. The result was a ratchet, a mechanism that could move in only one direction. The temple could only grow richer. It could never grow poorer. And as the wealth accumulated, century after century, dynasty after dynasty, the priesthood that managed that wealth accumulated power to match. By the end of the New Kingdom, Karnak owned more than 2/3 of all temple land in Egypt. Its Graiserodri held more grain than the royal treasury. Its herds numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The papyrus Harris I, a document from the reign of Ramesses III around 1150 BC, records the Temple of Amun at Karnak as owning 65 settlements, more than 400 gardens and orchards, more than 400,000 head of cattle, more than 80 ships, and more than 80,000 slaves and labourers. These are not the holdings of a religious institution, they are the holdings of a state, and the priesthood behaved accordingly. The high priests of Amun, men with titles like First Prophet of Amun, Overseer of the granaries of Amun, and Director of all the works of Amun, were not merely religious figures. They were administrators, politicians, and, increasingly, military commanders. They managed vast estates, they commanded labour forces, they negotiated with foreign powers, and they used the wealth of the temple to build their own tombs, their own monuments, and their own power bases, all within the shadow of Karnak. The Karnak cachette, Legraine's extraordinary discovery of 1903, is a window into this world. The cache contained statues spanning more than 2,000 years, from the Middle Kingdom to the Ptolemaic period. But the majority of the statues dated to the late New Kingdom and the Third Intermediate period, precisely the era when the priesthood was at the height of its power. Many of the statues were votive offerings, portraits of individuals who had served the temple and who wished to remain in the presence of the god for eternity. They represent priests, scribes, officials, and functionaries of every rank, the human infrastructure that kept Karnak running. Why were they buried? Legraine believed the cache was created during the Ptolemaic period, when the temple was undergoing renovation and the priests needed to clear space for new construction. Rather than destroy the ancient statues, which would have been sacrilegious, they buried them in a pit beneath the courtyard, preserving them while removing them from view. The burial was an act of piety, not of vandalism. The gods could not be thrown away, they could only be hidden. But the cache also tells a darker story. Some of the statues in the cache show signs of deliberate damage, names erased, faces smashed, inscriptions chiseled away. This damage was not caused by the burial. It was inflicted before the burial, possibly during one of the periodic waves of political upheaval that swept through Karnak's long history. A name erased from a statue is a person erased from the record. A face smashed from a sculpture is an identity destroyed. The cache for all its richness, is also a graveyard, a repository of erasures, of cancelled identities, of people and gods who fell out of favour and were punished in stone. And this brings us to the core problem, the question that Karnak poses to anyone who studies the intersection of religion and power. Was Karnak a temple that accumulated political power, or was it a political institution that used religion as its vehicle? Were the priests of Amun genuinely devout men who found themselves managing an unexpectedly large estate? Or were they political operators who used the theology of Amun as a justification for their own ambitions? The answer, as with most questions about the ancient world, is probably both. The priesthood of Amun was a genuinely religious institution. It maintained daily rituals, it preserved theological traditions, it provided for the worship of a god in whom its members genuinely believed. But it was also a power structure, an organization with resources, ambitions, and interests that sometimes conflicted with those of the pharaoh. The conflict came to a head during the reign of Akhenaten. His decision to abolish the worship of Amun and close the temples was not merely a religious reform, it was a political assault, an attempt to destroy the institution that had become the greatest check on royal power. By replacing Amun with the Aten, a god who had no established priesthood, no accumulated wealth, and no independent power base, Akhenaten was trying to recentralize authority in the person of the king. The Aten was a god that Akhenaten could control. Amun was a god that controlled itself. The failure of Akhenaten's revolution, the rapid restoration of the Amun cult after his death, demonstrates just how deeply the institutional power of Karnak was entrenched. The priests returned, the temples reopened, the wealth was reclaimed, and the theological status quo, Amun-Ra as king of the gods, Karnak as the center of the universe, was restored within a generation. Akhenaten's Talatat blocks were torn down and buried. His name was erased from the king lists. His revolution was treated not as a historical event, but as an aberration, a period of disorder, a break in the cosmic pattern, best forgotten, and Karnak continued to grow. Horemheb, the general who became pharaoh at the end of the 18th dynasty, built the 2nd and 9th pylons. Seti I and Ramesses II built the Hypostyle Hall. Ramesses III built a small temple within the Karnak compound, the Temple of Ramesses III in the first court, a complete miniature temple tucked inside the larger complex like a nesting doll. Each pharaoh added. Each addition was an act of political legitimacy. To build at Karnak was to declare oneself the true servant of Amun. To fail to build at Karnak was to risk the accusation of impiety, or worse, irrelevance. And the building continued even after the new kingdom ended. The Libyan pharaohs of the 22nd dynasty, the Shoshenq kings, added a massive forecourt in front of the first pylon. The Nubian pharaohs of the 25th dynasty added columns and chapels. The Sete pharaohs of the 26th dynasty restored and repaired earlier structures. The Persian conquerors of the 27th dynasty, surprisingly, did not destroy Karnak. They maintained it, even adding their own modest structures. Alexander the Great, after conquering Egypt in 332 BC, was depicted on the walls of Karnak making offerings to Amun, a Greek conqueror legitimizing his rule through the temple of the Egyptian god. And the Ptolemies, Alexander's Greek successors, continued to build at Karnak for 3 centuries. The last significant construction at Karnak dates to the reign of the Roman Emperor Augustus, the 1st century of the Common Era. By then, the temple was already 2,000 years old. It had been built by Egyptian pharaohs, maintained by Libyan and Nubian kings, expanded by Persian and Greek rulers, and tolerated by Roman emperors. It had survived every change of dynasty, every change of culture, every change of language that the Nile Valley had experienced over 2 millennia. It was the most durable institution in the history of the ancient world. And then it stopped. In 323 of the Common Era, the Roman Emperor Constantine ordered the closure of pagan temples across the empire. Christianity replaced the worship of Amun. The priests of Karnak, the last in a line stretching back 2,000 years, extinguished the torches, closed the shrine, and walked away. The daily ritual of awakening the god, feeding the god, and clothing the god, a ritual that had been performed every morning for 2 millennia, ceased. The barks were stowed. the sacred lake was neglected, the avenue of sphinxes was buried by silt, and Karnak, the center of the Egyptian religious universe, fell silent. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. The silence was not sudden. It was gradual. The temple had been declining for centuries before the final closure. The last pharaohs to build significantly at Karnak were the Ptolemies, Greek rulers who spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods, and built at Karnak primarily to maintain political legitimacy among their Egyptian subjects. Their construction was dutiful, not inspired. The theological energy that had driven the new kingdom builders, the genuine belief that Karnak was the center of the universe, the conviction that each new pylon brought the king closer to the gods, was gone. The Ptolemies built at Karnak the way a modern government maintains a national monument, out of obligation, not out of faith. And when the obligation ended, when Constantine's edict removed even the political reason to maintain the temple, there was nothing left. No faith, no obligation, no institution, no priests, no rituals, nothing but stone. 200 acres of stone, standing in the Egyptian sun, beginning the long process of decay that would continue for the next 17 centuries. The silence that followed the closure was not empty. It was thick with absence. The absence of chanting, of incense, of the sound of sandaled feet on stone floors. The absence of the torchlit processions that had wound through the columns of the Hypostyle Hall. The absence of the golden bark of Amun, glinting in the darkness of the sanctuary. For 2,000 years, Karnak had been alive, filled with human activity, human faith, human ambition. And then, within a few decades, it was dead. The columns still stood. The walls still bore their reliefs. The sacred lake still held its water, but the purpose was gone. The meaning was gone, and the stone, deprived of its function, began to crumble. The physical decay of Karnak after its closure is itself a story about what happens to a building when the institution that maintains it ceases to exist. The sandstone from which Karnak is primarily built is porous and soft. It absorbs water from the annual Nile flood and from the rising water table beneath the temple foundations. The absorbed water carries dissolved salts, sodium chloride, sodium sulfate, that crystallize as the stone dries, forcing apart the grains of the sandstone and causing it to crumble from within. This process, called salt weathering, is the primary destructive force at Karnak. It has been operating since the temple was built, but while the temple was active, the priests maintained it, replastering walls, replacing damaged blocks, diverting water away from the foundations. When the priests left, the maintenance stopped, and the decay accelerated. Earthquakes contributed to the damage. A major earthquake in 27 BC, during the reign of Augustus, toppled columns in the Hypostyle Hall and collapsed portions of the third pylon. Later earthquakes, less well documented, caused additional structural failures. By the medieval period, the temple was a ruin, its columns leaning, its walls fractured, its courtyards filled with rubble and sand. Local residents built houses within and on top of the ancient structures. A Coptic Christian church was constructed inside the Hypostyle Hall. The sacred lake became a watering hole for animals. The avenue of sphinxes was buried, and the name Karnak, which comes from the Arabic El Karnak, meaning fortified village, was applied not to the temple but to the settlement that had grown up among its ruins. The modern rediscovery of Karnak began in the early 19th century, when Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1798 produced the first systematic description and illustration of the temple. The scholars who accompanied the French army, the savants, measured the Hypostyle Hall, sketched the reliefs, and published their findings in the monumental Description de l'Egypte, which introduced Karnak to the European imagination. Their illustrations, drawn with scientific precision, showed a temple of staggering scale, columns rising above the rubble, reliefs emerging from centuries of accumulated sand, the ghost of a civilization preserved in stone. The first archaeological excavations began in the 1820s and continued throughout the 19th century. Auguste Mariette, the founder of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, worked at Karnak in the 1860s, clearing rubble from the Hypostyle Hall and uncovering portions of the Avenue of Sphinxes. Gaston Maspero continued the work in the 1880s and 90s, and Georges Legrain who arrived at Karnak in 1895 as director of works, began the systematic restoration that would define the site's modern appearance. Legrain was not merely an excavator, he was an engineer. His first major task was to stabilize the columns of the Hypostyle Hall, 11 of which had collapsed in 1899 due to a combination of structural failure and rising groundwater. Legrain rebuilt the columns from their fallen drums, constructing reinforced foundations and installing drainage systems to prevent further collapse. His work saved the Hypostyle Hall from total destruction, but it also altered the hall's appearance. The reconstructed columns are slightly different in alignment from the original, and the modern mortar that holds them together is visible between the ancient drums. The hall that visitors see today is not entirely ancient. It is a composite, original stone, stabilized by modern engineering, held together by 20th century intervention. This pattern of conservation, ancient structure maintained by modern effort, is the defining condition of Karnak today. The temple survives, not because it is indestructible, but because people have chosen to save it. The choice has been made repeatedly, by Legrain in the 1900s, by the Centre Franco-Egyptian since the 1960s, by the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities in the 21st century. Each generation has applied its best technology to the task of preserving the temple for the next generation. And each generation has confronted the same fundamental problem. The stone is soft, the water table is high, the earthquakes are unpredictable, and the resources available for conservation are finite. The battle to save Karnak is not won, it is ongoing. The salt weathering continues. The water table fluctuates with the seasons and with the management of the Aswan High Dam, which has altered the Nile's natural flood cycle, and, with it, the hydrological conditions beneath the temple. New techniques, including the injection of consolidating chemicals into the sandstone, have shown promise but have not been universally applied. And the sheer scale of the complex, 200 acres, thousands of blocks, hundreds of columns, millions of square centimeters of carved and painted surface, means that conservation must be selective. Not everything can be saved. Priorities must be set. Choices must be made. And every choice involves the acceptance that some of Karnak will be lost. But here's the problem. The things most at risk are often the things most worth saving. The painted surfaces, the original colours that once covered every wall, every column, every relief, are the most fragile and the most informative. Traces of red, blue, yellow, and green paint survive on the undersides of the Hypostyle Hall's capitals, protected from rain and sun by their elevated position. These traces are the last remnants of what was once a blaze of colour, a temple that was not the monochrome sandstone ruin we see today, but a polychromatic spectacle. Every surface painted, every figure outlined, every hieroglyph filled with pigment. The paint told the viewer which god was being depicted, what offering was being made, what ritual was being performed. Without it, the reliefs are shadows of their original selves, comprehensible but diminished, and the conservation work itself has revealed new information. The 2021 cleaning and restoration campaign in the Hypostyle Hall, which removed centuries of accumulated dust, soot, and surface deposits from the columns, uncovered original pigments that had been invisible for decades. The restored columns now show flashes of their original colours: the blue of a god's crown, the red of a king's skin, the yellow of a hieroglyphic cartouche. The restoration is, in a sense, a second discovery, revealing the temple not as it was when the archaeologists found it, but as it was when the priests last saw it. And the priests last saw it roughly 1700 years ago. That is a long time, but it is not as long as the time the temple was active. Karnak was alive for 2,000 years and has been dead for 1,700. It has spent more of its existence as a functioning temple than as a ruin, and the functioning period, the 2 millennia of continuous ritual, continuous construction, continuous reinvention, is the period that defines it. Karnak is not a ruin that was once a temple. Karnak is a temple that happens to be, at this particular moment in its history, in a state of disrepair. The difference matters. A ruin is finished, a temple is not. And Karnak, with its ongoing conservation, its continuing excavations, and its ever-expanding archaeological record, is not finished. It is still being read. It is still being understood, and it is still, in its way, growing, not in stone, but in knowledge. The economic model of Karnak, the ratchet of perpetual growth, has a parallel that modern observers will find uncomfortable. The temple's holdings grew because each donation was permanent and irreversible. The institution became wealthier with each entration because no mechanism existed to reduce its holdings. The pharaohs could give to Ammon, they could not take back. And the wealth, once given, generated its own momentum. The land produced grain. The grain fed workers. The workers maintained the temple attracted more donations, and the cycle continued. This is not unlike the growth of endowments in modern universities and religious institutions. Institutions that accumulate wealth through donations that are typically restricted to specific purposes and cannot be redirected. The largest university endowments in the modern world are measured in tens of billions of dollars. The Temple of Amun at Karnak, at its peak, controlled the equivalent of tens of billions in agricultural land, livestock, and precious materials. The scale is comparable, and the structural problem is identical. When an institution's wealth grows faster than its mission can absorb, the wealth begins to drive the mission rather than the other way around. At Karnak, this inversion of priorities was visible in the architecture. Each new pharaoh added structures not because the temple needed them, but because the pharaoh needed to be seen building. The pylons grew taller, the obelisks grew taller, the statues grew larger, the halls grew more elaborate. But the sanctuary, the small granite room at the heart of the complex where the god actually resided, remained the same size. The expansion was peripheral, not central. The temple was growing outward, not inward. The institution was expanding its physical footprint, while its spiritual footprint remained static. This pattern of peripheral growth around a static core is diagnostic of institutional maturity. Young institutions are focused on their mission. Mature institutions are focused on their image. The earlier structures at Karnak, the White Chapel of Senusret, the small sanctuaries of the Middle Kingdom, were focused on the god. The later structures, the colossal pylons of the 19th dynasty, the vast forecourts of the 22nd, were focused on the pharaoh. The shift from god-centered to pharaoh-centered construction is the architectural expression of institutional aging. And the aging was terminal. The institution did not die suddenly. It died slowly, over centuries. As the gap between the temple's theological claim and its political reality widened beyond repair, Karnak claimed to be the center of the universe. But by the Ptolemaic period, the universe had expanded. The Greeks had brought new gods, new philosophies, new ways of understanding the cosmos that did not require a granite sanctuary on the banks of the Nile. The Romans brought new administrative structures that did not require a priestly bureaucracy in Thebes. And Christianity brought a new theology that did not require Amun-Ra at all. Each of these challenges eroded the temple's relevance. Not its physical structure, the stone continued to stand, but its institutional function, the reason for its existence, the purpose it served in the lives of the people who worshipped there. By the time Constantine issued his decree, the temple was already a relic. The decree did not kill Karnak. It merely certified the death, and the library is still being read. Each year, new translations of Karnak's inscriptions are published. New archaeological campaigns reveal new structures and new inscriptions. New conservation work uncovers new pigments and new details on surfaces that had been obscured by centuries of grime. The reading of Karnak, the slow, patient, multi-generational process of extracting meaning from stone, is one of the great ongoing intellectual projects of the modern world. It has been underway for 2 centuries. It will continue for centuries more, because the library is vast. 200 acres of inscribed stone, much of it still only partially translated, much of it still buried or inaccessible, much of it deteriorating but still legible. The reading will never be complete. The library is too large, the languages are too complex, the histories are too entangled. But each new reading adds to the sum of human understanding, and each new reading reveals, once again, how much remains to be read. Karnak is the text that writes itself, that grows with each generation's contribution, that accumulates meaning the way the temple accumulated stone, layer by layer, pharaoh by pharaoh, century by century. To read Karnak is to read the longest continuous document in human history. A document written not in ink on paper, but in relief on sandstone, spanning 2,000 years, recording the ambitions and anxieties and achievements and failures of 30 generations of builders who believed they were building the home of God. They were building something else. They were building a record of what human beings can accomplish when they believe that what they are building matters more than anything else in the world. A record of devotion so intense that it lasted 2 millennia. A record of ambition so vast that it covered 200 acres. A record of faith so deep that it sustained a civilization for 30 centuries. The record survives, the faith does not, and Karnak, silent, magnificent, eroding, enduring, holds both the record and its absence in equal measure. The stone speaks of what was built, the silence speaks of what was lost. And together, stone and silence, Karnak tells the full story of human aspiration, the building and the breaking, the creation and the forgetting, the 2,000 years of sound and the 1,700 years of quiet that followed. Walk through Karnak from west to east, along the main processional axis, and take each structure in turn. Let each one tell its story, and feel how the stories accumulate, how the weight of 20 centuries of construction presses down on the ground beneath your feet. Begin at the first pylon. This is the entrance to the complex, the massive mud brick and stone gateway that faces the Nile to the west. It is the youngest of Karnak's 10 pylons, begun during the 30th dynasty around 380 BC and never completed. The pylon is 113 meters wide and 15 meters thick, the largest gateway in Egypt, but its upper courses were never finished. The mud brick construction ramps, used to raise the stones into position, are still visible against the north tower, fossilized scaffolding preserved by the abandonment of the project. The ramps were never removed because the construction was never completed. The first pylon of Karnak is, ironically, the last thing the pharaohs built here, and they never finished it. Pass through the first pylon and enter the first court, an enormous open space, roughly 100 meters by 80 meters, bounded on the north and south by colonnades and on the east by the second pylon. In the center of the court stands a single column, the only surviving column of what was once a kiosk built by Taharqa, a Nubian pharaoh of the 25th dynasty, around 690 BC. Taharqa's kiosk originally had 10 columns, each more than 20 meters tall, supporting a wooden roof. It was one of the most impressive structures in the first court. Now a single column remains, lonely, monumental, the last survivor of a building that outlasted its dynasty by only a few centuries. To the left, against the north wall of the court, stands the small temple of Ramesses III, a complete, self-contained temple tucked inside the Karnak complex, like a jewel in a crown. This temple, with its own pylon, courtyard, hypostyle hall, and sanctuary, is one of the best preserved structures at Karnak. Its reliefs show Ramesses making offerings to the Theban triad Amun, Mut, and Khonsu, and celebrating his military victories. The temple is modest by Karnak standards. It would be a major monument anywhere else in Egypt, but here, surrounded by structures many times its size, it registers as a chapel. Pass through the second pylon and enter the Great Hypostyle Hall. This is the moment that every visitor to Karnak remembers. The sudden transition from bright sunlight to columned shadow, from open sky to stone forest. The columns close in from every side. The scale is disorienting. The ceiling, though now largely missing, would have been roughly 25 meters above the floor along the central aisle, high enough to accommodate a 6-story building. The remaining columns, stained by centuries of weather, still bear traces of their original paint and the sharp edges of their carved reliefs. In the morning light, when the sun strikes the eastern face of the columns at a low angle, the reliefs leap into 3 dimensions. Gods and kings emerging from the stone with a vividness that photographs cannot capture. Walk slowly through the hall, read the columns. The northern half, decorated by Seti I, is carved in bas-relief. Delicate, shallow carving in which the figures project slightly from the background. The southern half, decorated by Ramesses II, is carved in sunk relief, deeper carving in which the figures are cut into the surface. The difference in technique is visible to the naked eye. Seti's reliefs are more refined, more detailed, more aesthetically accomplished. Ramesses' reliefs are bolder, more dramatic, more visible from a distance. The two styles, side by side in the same building, represent two approaches to monumental art, the intimate and the imperial. Together, they create a dialogue across generations. Father and son, teacher and student, the artist and the propagandist, speaking to each other across the central aisle of the greatest hall in Egypt. Pass through the third pylon, built by Amenhotep III, the pleasure-loving pharaoh whose reign marked the zenith of 18th dynasty wealth, and enter a narrower space bounded by the fourth and fifth pylons. Here, between the pylons, stands the surviving obelisk of Hatshepsut, nearly 30 meters of pink Aswan granite, still bearing its original inscriptions, still pointing at the sky. The second obelisk, its pair, has fallen and lies in fragments nearby. Stand at the base of the standing obelisk and look up. The shaft tapers so gradually that it appears perfectly straight, a needle of stone, impossibly tall, impossibly slender, impossibly old. Hatshepsut's inscription runs along the shaft. I have done this with a loving heart for my father Amun. My heart was not forgetful of any project. Beyond the obelisks, the temple narrows further. The spaces become smaller, the ceilings lower, the darkness deeper. This is intentional. The Egyptian temple was designed as a journey from the public to the private, from the profane to the sacred. The outermost areas, the forecourts, the first pylon, the hypostyle hall, were accessible to larger numbers of people. But as you moved deeper into the temple, the spaces contracted, the access became more restricted, and the sanctity increased. Only the most senior priests could enter the innermost chambers, and only the high priest or the pharaoh himself could enter the sanctuary of Amun-Ra, the holiest room in the holiest temple in the holiest city in Egypt. The sanctuary, located at the very heart of the Karnak complex, is surprisingly small. A simple granite chamber, roughly 5 meters by 3 meters, that once held the sacred statue of Amun-Ra. The statue is gone, removed or destroyed in antiquity. The chamber is bare. The walls are inscribed with the cartouches of Philip Aridaeus, the half-brother of Alexander the Great, who rebuilt the sanctuary in the 4th century BC. But the chamber itself occupies the same position that the original Middle Kingdom sanctuary occupied 2,000 years earlier. The spot has not changed. The building has been rebuilt, renovated, and reconstructed many times. But the sacred center, the point where the god resided, has remained fixed for 4 millennia. This stability of the sacred center, amid the constant change of the surrounding structures, is one of Karnak's most remarkable features. The temple grew outward from the sanctuary, each pharaoh adding structures around the edges, while leaving the core untouched. The result is a concentric pattern, oldest at the center, youngest at the periphery, that mirrors the Egyptian concept of sacred space. The sanctuary was the primeval mound, the first land to emerge from the waters of chaos. The surrounding structures were the created world, growing outward from that original point, layer by layer, as creation expanded from the first moment of existence. Now turn south. Leave the main east-west axis and follow the secondary north-south axis, which leads from the hypostyle hall to the precinct of Mut, the goddess who was Amun's consort, the divine mother of the Theban triad. The path is marked by the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th pylons, 4 massive gateways, each one built by a different pharaoh, each one smaller than the last as the axis approaches the Mut precinct. Along this path, between the 7th and 8th pylons, lies the Cachette Court, the courtyard where Legrain made his extraordinary discovery in 1903. Legrain's excavation of the Cachette was an ordeal. The water table at Karnak is high, barely 2 meters below the surface in some areas, and the courtyard where the statues were buried was frequently flooded. Legrain and his workers pumped water continuously, working in mud and standing water, hauling statues from the waterlogged pit one by one. The excavation lasted 4 years, from 1903 to 1907. The conditions were brutal. Legrain's health suffered. He developed the eye disease that would eventually blind him, but he persisted, and the result was one of the most important archaeological discoveries in the history of Egyptology. The 700 stone statues and 17,000 bronze figurines that Legrain recovered span more than 2,000 years of Karnak's history. They include portraits of pharaohs, priests, scribes, and officials. The human population of the temple, preserved in stone and metal. Many of the statues are of extraordinary quality. The black granite statue of Thutmose III in the pose of a kneeling king is considered one of the finest royal portraits of the New Kingdom. Others are more modest, small votive figures left by ordinary devotees who wish to remain in the presence of the god. The cachette raises as many questions as it answers. Why were so many statues buried together? Was the burial planned or hasty? Did it occur as a single event or over a period of time? Was it motivated by piety, the desire to preserve sacred objects, or by practicality, the need to clear space for new construction? Scholars have debated these questions since Lagrange's time. The most widely accepted theory is that the burial occurred during the Ptolemaic period, when major renovations to the courtyard required the removal of the accumulated statuary. But alternative theories have been proposed, and the debate continues. The cachette is now the subject of a major international research project, the Karnak Cachette Database Project, which aims to catalogue every object recovered by Lagrange and to reconstruct the original context of the deposit. The project, using Lagrange's field notes, photographs, and published descriptions, is assembling a comprehensive record of one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. The work is painstaking. Lagrange's records, while thorough, are sometimes inconsistent, and many objects have been dispersed to museums around the world. But the project is making progress, and each new connection between an object and its original position in the cache adds to our understanding of how Karnak functioned as a religious institution. Beyond the cachette court, the path continues south to the precinct of Mute, a separate walled compound containing the Temple of Mute, a sacred lake in the shape of a crescent, and hundreds of black granite statues of the lion-headed goddess Sekhmet. These statues, more than 700 of them were originally produced, are among the most haunting images at Karnak. Sekhmet, the goddess of war and plague, stands or sits in identical poses, her lion's face staring forward with an expression that is simultaneously calm and terrifying. The sheer number of statues, row after row, hundreds of identical faces, creates an effect that is less artistic than atmospheric. The precinct of Mut feels different from the rest of Karnak, quieter, darker, more unsettling. The goddess of destruction presides over her temple with a patience that the casual visitor can sense but cannot explain. And there is one more area that deserves attention: the temple of Khonsu, the moon god, son of Ammon and Mut. This smaller temple, located in the southwest corner of the Karnak compound, was built primarily by Ramesses III and decorated by later pharaohs. It is one of the best preserved temples at Karnak, its walls intact, its reliefs sharp, its ceiling partially preserved. The temple follows the standard Egyptian plan: pylon, courtyard, hypostyle hall, sanctuary, and contains reliefs of exceptional quality, showing the king performing rituals in the presence of the gods. It is a temple within a temple, a self-contained sacred space embedded in the larger sacred landscape of Karnak. The cumulative effect of walking through Karnak, from the first pylon to the Mute precinct, from the hypostyle hall to the temple of Khonsu, from the obelisks to the sacred lake, is not merely visual. It is temporal. You are walking through time. You are physically moving through 20 centuries of human effort, 20 centuries of theological evolution, 20 centuries of political competition and artistic innovation. Each step takes you deeper, deeper into the complex, deeper into the past, deeper into the mind of a civilization that believed it was building the home of the creator of the universe. And the most unsettling thing about Karnak is not its scale, it is its silence. 200 acres of stone, standing in the Egyptian sun, inhabited now only by tourists and archaeologists and the occasional stray cat. The priests are gone. The rituals are gone. The barks are gone. The god is gone. What remains is architecture, magnificent, overwhelming, endlessly detailed architecture, and the absence of everything that once gave it meaning. The processional experience of Karnak was not limited to the east-west axis. The temple operated on multiple axes, each serving a different liturgical purpose. The north-south axis, running from the hypostyle hall to the precinct of Mute, was used during festivals honoring the divine consort. The Avenue of Sphinxes, running south to the Luxor temple, was the route of the Opet festival, and within the temple itself, smaller processional routes connected individual chapels, shrines, and storage chambers, creating a network of sacred pathways that the priests navigated daily. The daily ritual at Karnak, the service that was performed every morning for 2,000 years, followed a precise sequence. Before dawn, the officiating priest would purify himself in the sacred lake. He would then enter the temple through a side door, passing through increasingly restricted spaces until he reached the sanctuary. The doors of the granite shrine were sealed with a clay seal bearing the royal cartouche. The priest would break the seal, open the doors, and reveal the sacred statue of Amun-Ra, a small golden figure, perhaps only half a meter tall, draped in linen, adorned with jewels, resting on a pedestal within the shrine. The priest would prostrate himself before the statue. He would then begin the ritual of the morning toilet, washing the statue, anointing it with sacred oils, dressing it in fresh linen, applying kohl to its eyes, and presenting it with offerings of food, flowers, and incense. The ritual was not symbolic. The Egyptians believed the god was literally present in the statue, that Amun-Ra inhabited the golden figure and received the offerings as sustenance. The food was real food, the clothing was real clothing, the kohl was real kohl, and the god consumed the spiritual essence of each offering, just as the ka of a dead person consumed the essence of tomb offerings. After the morning ritual, the shrine was resealed, the doors were closed, and the priest withdrew, sweeping his footprints from the floor as he left, so that no trace of human presence would remain in the god's chamber. This ritual was performed every single day, without exception, for 2,000 years. The cumulative number of performances, roughly 730,000 morning rituals over the temple's active life, is staggering. 730,000 mornings, 730,000 broken seals, 730,000 prostrations, 730,000 offerings of bread, beer, oil, and incense. The weight of repetition is almost unbearable to contemplate, and each repetition was, in the priest's understanding, essential, because the ritual sustained the god, and the god sustained the cosmic order. If the ritual ceased, the god would weaken. If the god weakened, the cosmic order would falter. If the cosmic order faltered, chaos would return. The morning ritual at Karnak was not a ceremony. It was a cosmic maintenance program, the daily servicing of the machine that kept the universe running. The priests who performed this ritual were not ascetics or mystics. They were professionals, members of a hereditary priesthood, trained from childhood, organized into 4 rotating shifts called philae. Each phyle served the temple for 1 month at a time, then rotated out, returning to their own estates, their own families, their own lives for the remaining 3 months. The priesthood was not full-time employment. It was a rotation, a civic duty, similar to military service, but sacred in nature. During their month of service, the priests lived within the temple compound, in mud brick houses, whose remains have been found along the temple's outer walls. They were subject to strict rules of purity. They shaved their heads and bodies, wore white linen garments, abstained from certain foods, and bathed multiple times daily. They were, for the duration of their service, ritually clean, separated from the world of the living, dedicated entirely to the service of the god. The institutional complexity of this system is remarkable, managing the rotation of 4 philae, each containing dozens or hundreds of priests, across a temple complex that operated on multiple simultaneous ritual schedules, required a bureaucracy of considerable sophistication. The temple maintained archives, records of donations, inventories of sacred objects, calendars of festivals, lists of priests and their assignments. These records, inscribed on papyrus and stone, are the primary source for our understanding of how Karnak functioned as an institution. And the institution functioned smoothly, for centuries, for millennia. The priests rotated, the rituals continued, the donations accumulated, the buildings grew, the god was fed, the universe was sustained. And Karnak, growing ever larger, ever wealthier, ever more powerful, became the most impressive demonstration of institutional continuity in the history of human civilization, until it stopped, until the decree, until the silence. The economic power of Karnak had consequences far beyond the temple walls. The institution's vast agricultural holdings made it a major player in the Egyptian grain market. The temple granaries, located within the compound walls, held reserves sufficient to feed thousands of people for months. During famines, which occurred periodically when the Nile flood was too low or too high, the temple's grain reserves became a matter of life and death. The priests of Amun could distribute grain to the hungry population of Thebes, earning loyalty and political capital that further enhanced their power. The temple also functioned as a banking institution. Private individuals could deposit valuables at the temple for safekeeping, essentially using the sacred compound as a secure vault. Loans were made against these deposits. Interest was charged. The temple was, in modern terms, a financial services provider, a bank with a divine charter operating under the protection of Amun-Ra and backed by the largest real estate portfolio in Egypt. The workshops within the Karnak compound produced a range of goods, from sacred furniture and ritual objects to everyday items like pottery and textiles. Skilled craftsmen were employed year-round, their work supervised by temple administrators. The products of these workshops were used within the temple, distributed to dependent communities, or traded with other institutions. The temple was not merely a consumer of Egypt's wealth. It was a producer, a manufacturing center, as well as a spiritual one. This economic dimension of Karnak is often overlooked in popular accounts, which tend to focus on the spiritual and architectural aspects of the complex. But the economics are inseparable from the architecture. Every pylon, every column, every obelisk was paid for. The sandstone was quarried by workers who needed to be fed. The granite was transported by boats that needed to be built. The gold that covered the obelisk tips was mined by laborers who needed to be supervised. The construction of Karnak was not a miracle. It was a managed project, a project funded by the most powerful economic institution in the ancient world, using resources that had been accumulated over centuries. And the management was documented. Papyri from the Karnak archives, preserved by the dry climate and recovered by archaeologists over the past century, provide detailed records of the temple's financial operations. These documents record income from agricultural estates, expenditures on construction and maintenance, inventories of sacred objects, and the wages paid to temple personnel. They are, in effect, the annual reports of a major institutional employer. The spreadsheets of the ancient world preserved on papyrus instead of hard drives. The loss of most of these archives, destroyed by fire, flood, insects, and the natural decomposition of organic material, is one of the great tragedies of Egyptology. The surviving fragments give us glimpses of the temple's operations, but the full picture, the complete financial history of the wealthiest institution in the ancient world, is gone. The stone survives, the papyrus does not, and with the papyrus, the administrative detail that would allow us to understand Karnak, not just as an architectural monument, but as an economic system, has been largely lost. What we can reconstruct from the surviving evidence suggests an institution of extraordinary complexity and efficiency. The temple managed thousands of employees. It administered hundreds of thousands of acres of agricultural land. It maintained a fleet of boats for transporting grain and construction materials. It operated workshops producing everything from temple furniture to ceremonial clothing. And it did all of this while simultaneously maintaining the daily rituals, the festival calendar, and the theological library that were the temple's primary purpose. The sheer administrative capacity of Karnak, the ability to manage all of these operations simultaneously, without computers, without telecommunications, without any of the tools that modern organizations take for granted, is itself a monument to ancient Egyptian organizational genius. The pyramids are often cited as evidence of Egyptian engineering skill, but the management of Karnak, sustained over 2 millennia, may be an even more impressive achievement. Building a pyramid requires engineering, running a temple state requires management, and management, unlike engineering, leaves no monumental trace. The evidence for Karnak's management, the papyri, the ostraca, the institutional records, is fragmentary and deteriorating. The evidence for its engineering, the columns, the pylons, the obelisks, stands in the Egyptian sun, visible and eternal. This asymmetry between the visibility of the engineering and the invisibility of the management distorts our understanding of Karnak. We see the columns and assume they are the achievement, but the columns were built by workers who were managed by scribes, who were supervised by officials, who were appointed by the high priest, who was authorized by the pharaoh. The columns are the product of a system, and the system, the institutional infrastructure that planned, funded, built, and maintained the temple, is the real achievement. The columns are impressive. The system that produced them is extraordinary. And the system lasted 2,000 years. No modern corporation has lasted 2,000 years. No modern university has lasted 2,000 years. No modern government has lasted 2,000 years. The priesthood of Amun at Karnak is the longest-running continuous institution in recorded history, and its longevity is not merely a curiosity. It is a data point, the most extreme data point we have, about the conditions under which institutions can endure. What were those conditions? Stable geography. Karnak's position on the Nile ensured reliable access to water, agriculture, and transportation. Stable theology. The worship of Amun-Ra provided a consistent institutional mission that transcended individual reigns. Stable economics. The ratchet of perpetual donations ensured that the institution's wealth only grew. And stable politics. For most of its history, the Egyptian state supported Karnak as a pillar of royal legitimacy. Remove any one of these conditions, and the institution would have faltered. Remove all of them, as the transition to Christianity did, and the institution collapsed. The lesson is clear. Longevity requires the alignment of multiple supportive conditions. When the conditions hold, the institution can last for millennia. When the conditions change, the institution can die in a generation. And this is perhaps the deepest lesson of Karnak, the lesson that connects the ancient temple to the modern world. We build our institutions, our universities, our libraries, our archives, our governments, and we assume they will endure. We endow them with resources, we give them legal protections, we inscribe their purposes in founding documents and constitutional charters. But we cannot guarantee the conditions that sustain them. We cannot guarantee that the political system will continue to support them. We cannot guarantee that the theology or the ideology or the social consensus that gives them purpose will remain stable. We can build the columns, we cannot guarantee the faith. Karnak's columns are still standing, the faith is gone, and the gap between the two, between what endures and what dissolves, between the physical structure and the institutional purpose, is the space in which every civilization, including our own, must learn to live. The weight of Karnak's history is not merely intellectual, it is physical. The foundations of the temple bear the literal weight of 20 centuries of accumulated construction. Each new pharaoh built on top of, beside, and around the structures of their predecessors. The result is a stratigraphic nightmare. Layers of construction from different periods, built to different standards, using different materials and different techniques. Disentangling these layers is one of the primary tasks of the Centre Franco-Egyptian, whose archaeologists have spent decades producing detailed plans and cross-sections of the temple's construction sequence. The task is complicated by the practice of block reuse. Pharaohs routinely dismantled the structures of their predecessors and used the blocks as fill for their own constructions. The Talatat blocks of Akhenaten are the most famous example, but they are far from the only one. Blocks from the White Chapel of Senusret I were found inside the third pylon of Amenhotep III. The Middle Kingdom chapel had been taken apart and its blocks, some still bearing their original reliefs, had been used as rubble fill inside a later structure. The discovery of these reused blocks, beginning in the 1920s, has allowed archaeologists to reconstruct entire buildings that no longer exist above ground. The White Chapel, now reassembled and displayed in the open-air museum at Karnak, was rebuilt from blocks extracted from the third pylon. It exists today because it was destroyed, because its blocks were preserved inside a later structure that protected them from weathering and theft. This paradox, destruction as preservation, is another of Karnak's recurring themes. The buildings that survived above ground have been exposed to 4,000 years of weather, earthquakes, and human interference. The buildings that were dismantled and buried have been protected by the very structures that consumed them. The demolished buildings are, in many cases, better preserved than the standing ones. The fragments are sharper, the reliefs are crisper, the paint is brighter, because the buried blocks were sealed away from light, air, and moisture for millennia. The open-air museum at Karnak, located in the northwest corner of the compound, displays several of these reconstructed buildings: the White Chapel of Senusret, the Red Chapel of Hatshepsut, the Alabaster Chapel of Amenhotep I. These structures, assembled from recovered blocks like three-dimensional jigsaw puzzles, provide a window into periods of Karnak's history that are otherwise inaccessible. They show us what the temple looked like before the New Kingdom pharaohs transformed it into the colossal complex we see today. And they remind us that the Karnak we visit is not the only Karnak that existed. Beneath the visible temple, buried in the foundations, hidden inside the pylons, lies another Karnak, an older, smaller, more intimate temple, dismantled and consumed by the temple that replaced it. The relationship between the visible and the invisible at Karnak is a microcosm of the relationship between preservation and loss in all of archaeology. What we see is what survived above ground, the latest, largest, most durable structures built by the most powerful pharaohs. What we do not see, except in fragments extracted from the fill of later buildings, is everything that came before. The history of Karnak is the history of replacement. Each pharaoh's contribution replaced, absorbed, or concealed the contributions of earlier pharaohs. The temple grew by consuming its own past, and the consumption continues. Conservation replaces deteriorated blocks with new ones. Restoration campaigns apply modern materials to ancient surfaces. Archaeological excavation removes material that has been in place for centuries. Each intervention, however necessary, however carefully conducted, alters the monument. The Karnak that visitors see today is not the Karnak that existed 100 years ago. It is not the Karnak that will exist 100 years from now. The temple is still changing. It is still being written. And the story it tells, the story of 2,000 years of construction, followed by 1,700 years of decay, followed by 200 years of conservation, is a story that has not yet reached its conclusion. The sacred lake, now maintained by groundwater rather than the Nile flood, still reflects the columns and the obelisks and the sky. The water is still present, the meaning has changed, but the reflection, the inverted image of the temple, shimmering on the surface of the water, distorted by the slightest breeze, is still the same. The temple looks at itself across 4 millennia and sees in the water what it has always seen, a mirror of its own ambition, wavering but persistent, never quite still, never quite clear. The individual structures within Karnak's 4 precincts deserve more attention than most accounts give them. The precinct of Montu, to the north of the main Amun precinct, was dedicated to the falcon-headed war god who had been the principal deity of Thebes before Amun's rise. Montu's temple, smaller and less well preserved than the temple of Amun, is a reminder of the theological revolution that transformed Thebes from a regional cult center into the spiritual capital of an empire. Before Amun, there was Montu. Before the king of the gods, there was the god of war, and the physical proximity of the 2 precincts, Montu to the north, Amun at the center, preserves the memory of that transition in the geography of the site. The precinct of Mut, to the south, is equally significant. Mut, the consort of Amun and the mother of Khonsu, was a goddess of great power. Her name means simply mother, and her divine role was the maternal principle itself. Her temple, surrounded by its crescent-shaped sacred lake, contains the extraordinary collection of Sekhmet statues, more than 700 originally, each one a life-sized or larger representation of the lion-headed goddess of destruction and healing. Amenhotep III commissioned 2 statues for each day of the year, 730 in total, creating a calendar in stone, a timekeeping device made of divine images. The Sekhmet statues are among the most powerful objects at Karnak. Made of black diorite or granodiorite, each one depicts the goddess either standing or seated, wearing the sun disk on her head, holding the Ankh, the symbol of life, in one hand. The statues are nearly identical, but not quite. Each one has subtle variations in posture, proportion, and detail that distinguish it from its neighbors. The effect of seeing hundreds of them arranged in rows, their lion faces staring forward in eternal vigilance, is profoundly unsettling. These are not decorative objects. They are theological instruments, each one designed to appease the dangerous goddess Sekhmet and prevent her from unleashing plague and destruction upon Egypt. The theology behind the Sekhmet statues is complex. In Egyptian mythology, Sekhmet was the instrument of divine punishment, the lion sent by Ra to destroy humanity when it rebelled against the gods. She was so effective in her destruction that Ra had to trick her into stopping, pouring beer dyed red to look like blood on the ground, which Sekhmet drank, became intoxicated, and fell asleep. The story, the myth of the destruction of humanity, was one of the most important religious narratives in Egyptian theology, and the Sekhmet statues at Karnak were a daily reminder of the goddess's power and the need to keep her appeased. The precinct of Mut, with its Sekhmet statues and its crescent lake, is one of the least visited and most atmospheric areas of Karnak. Tourists, drawn by the massive Hypostyle Hall and the famous first pylon, rarely venture this far south. The precinct is quieter, more overgrown, more evocative of the temple's original atmosphere. The columns are smaller, the spaces more intimate, the darkness more complete. Here, away from the crowds, with the Sekhmet statues staring from their niches, one can begin to sense what Karnak might have felt like as a living sacred space. Not a spectacle, but a presence. Not a tourist attraction, but a place where gods were fed and plagues were averted, and the cosmic order was maintained, day after day, for 2,000 years. The four precincts of Karnak, Amun, Mut, Montu, and a fourth smaller precinct dedicated to Amenhotep IV before his transformation into Akhenaten, together form a theological map. The Amun precinct at the center represents the supreme creator. Mut to the south represents the divine mother. Montu to the north represents the warrior principle. And the Aten precinct, now largely destroyed, represents the heretical alternative, the road not taken, the theology that challenged Amun and lost. The four precincts are the four corners of the Egyptian religious universe, arranged on a single site, each one expressing a different aspect of the divine. This spatial theology is one of Karnak's most remarkable features, and one of the least appreciated by modern visitors, who tend to experience the site as a sequence of impressive structures rather than as a coherent theological program. The program is there. It is legible, it is encoded in the orientation of buildings, the placement of statues, the alignment of axes, and the relationship between precincts. But reading it requires knowledge that the average visitor does not have. Knowledge of Egyptian theology, knowledge of temple architecture, knowledge of the symbolic language that the priests of Amun spoke in stone. This is the interpretive challenge that Karnak poses to the modern world. The physical monument is preserved. The intellectual framework that gives it meaning is largely lost. We can see the temple. We cannot read it. We can admire the columns. We cannot understand what they represent. We can walk through the Hypostyle Hall. We cannot feel the darkness, the incense, the weight of theological responsibility that the priests felt when they walked the same path. The temple is open. The meaning is closed. And the gap between the two is the gap that all of us, scholars, tourists, documentary viewers listening at 2 a.m, must learn to navigate. The gap is not unbridgeable. Decades of scholarly work have reconstructed much of the theological program. The inscriptions have been translated. The rituals have been described. The festival calendar has been reconstructed. We know more about how Karnak functioned as a religious institution than we know about most ancient temples. But knowledge is not experience. Understanding is not belief. And the temple, for all our understanding, remains at a remove. Beautiful, impressive, informative, but ultimately foreign. A world we can study but cannot inhabit. A faith we can describe but cannot share. A silence we can hear but cannot fill. The deeper truth of Karnak is not about Egypt. It is about what happens when a religious institution becomes an economic institution, when faith is funded, when devotion generates wealth, and when the wealth becomes more important than the devotion. This is not an ancient problem, it is a contemporary one. Every religious institution in the modern world faces the same tension, the tension between spiritual mission and financial reality, between theological purpose and administrative power. between serving the divine and managing the portfolio. Karnak is the oldest and most dramatic example of how that tension plays out over time. And the lesson it teaches is sobering. The lesson is this: institutions grow. They grow because each generation adds to them. New buildings, new endowments, new programs, new staff. The additions are well-intentioned. Each one serves a genuine need. But the cumulative effect is a ratchet, a mechanism that can only move in one direction. The institution becomes larger, it becomes wealthier, it becomes more powerful. And at some point, a point that is never clear until it has been passed, the institution becomes so large, so wealthy, so powerful that it begins to serve itself, rather than the purpose for which it was created. Karnak reached that point sometime in the late New Kingdom. The temple that had been built to serve Amun-Ra became the institution that employed the priests, who managed the estates that funded the construction, that glorified the pharaohs, who legitimized the priesthood that controlled the wealth. The circle was closed, the system was self-sustaining, and the god, the actual deity, the theological being at the center of it all, became, in a practical sense, secondary. The rituals continued, the offerings were made, the hymns were chanted, but the purpose of the institution had shifted. It was no longer primarily about serving Amun. It was about preserving Karnak. This is not cynicism. This is the sociology of institutions. Every institution, religious, political, academic, corporate, tends towards self-perpetuation. The original mission is gradually displaced by the goal of institutional survival. The means become the ends. The temple that was built to house the god becomes the god itself, an object of devotion in its own right, worshipped not for what it represents, but for what it is. And when the institution finally fails, when the Roman Empire imposes Christianity and the temples close, the architecture survives, but the institution does not. The stone endures, the organization dissolves, the columns still stand, the priesthood vanishes, and Karnak becomes what it is today, a magnificent shell, emptied of its original content, preserved by its physical durability, and visited by people who can admire its scale but cannot replicate its function. Let that sink in. The largest religious complex in human history, an institution that lasted 2,000 years, that employed tens of thousands of people, that controlled more wealth than most nations, that served as the spiritual center of the most powerful civilization in the ancient world, failed, not because it was destroyed by enemies, not because it was overwhelmed by natural disaster, but because the theological framework that sustained it was replaced by a different one. Christianity arrived, the old gods departed, and the temple, deprived of its purpose, ceased to function. The stones did not care. The stones are still there, but the faith is gone. And without the faith, the stones are just stones. Impressive stones, beautiful stones, historically significant stones, but stones nonetheless. The lesson of Karnak is that buildings are not institutions. Buildings last because they are made of matter. Institutions last because they are made of belief. And belief, unlike matter, can be replaced overnight. This is not science fiction, this is history. The largest religious institution in the ancient world was destroyed not by an army, but by an idea. The idea that there was one God, not many, and that the one God did not live at Karnak. That idea, propagated by missionaries and enforced by emperors, accomplished in a few decades what earthquakes, floods, and wars had failed to accomplish in 2 millennia. It emptied the temple, it silenced the hymns, it ended the rituals, and it left Karnak, magnificent, enormous 200-acre Karnak, abandoned, a city of stone without a single inhabitant. The parallel between Karnak and modern institutions extends even further when you consider the question of legitimacy. For the pharaohs, building at Karnak was not optional. It was a requirement of kingship. A pharaoh who did not build at Karnak was a pharaoh who had not demonstrated his devotion to Amun-Ra, and therefore a pharaoh whose legitimacy was in question. The temple was not just a religious site, it was a proving ground for political authority. Each new pylon, each new obelisk, each new hall was a public declaration: I am the legitimate king. The gods accept me. Look at what I have built. This dynamic, in which institutional investment becomes a marker of political legitimacy, is familiar in the modern world. Governments build monuments. Corporations build headquarters. Universities build campuses. Each construction is, among other things, a statement of legitimacy, a physical declaration that the institution is real, important, and permanent. The larger the building, the more permanent the institution appears, and the appearance of permanence is itself a source of power. Karnak exploited this dynamic for 2,000 years. Each pharaoh built bigger than the last, not because the temple needed more space, but because the pharaoh needed more legitimacy. The first pylon was wider than the second was more elaborate than the third. The hypostyle hall was larger than any hall that had come before. The obelisks were taller than any obelisks that had been raised. The escalation was relentless. And the escalation was driven not by theological need, but by political competition. And yet the competition, for all its political motivation, produced something genuinely extraordinary. The hypostyle hall is not merely a political statement. It is one of the most overwhelming interior spaces ever created. The reliefs on its walls are not merely propaganda. They are masterworks of ancient art. The obelisks of Hatshepsut are not merely acts of royal vanity. They are engineering marvels that have stood for 35 centuries. The political motivations that drove the construction of Karnak are undeniable, but the results transcend the motivations. The monument is greater than the sum of its causes, and that transcendence, the gap between the politician's purpose and the artist's achievement, is what makes Karnak not just an archaeological site, but a work of art. The art survives because the stone survives. The politics, the dynastic rivalries, the succession disputes, the petty competitions that motivated each new construction are dust. The art remains. The columns remain, the reliefs remain, and the sacred lake remains, reflecting the sky and the stone, holding the silence, waiting. The question of what survives and what dissolves is not merely philosophical at Karnak. It is practical. The conservation challenges facing the temple are among the most severe of any archaeological site in the world. The sandstone from which most of Karnak is built is a sedimentary rock composed of cemented sand grains, strong enough to hold its shape for millennia, but vulnerable to water, salt, and chemical attack. The annual flooding of the Nile, which ceased after the construction of the Aswan High Dam in the 1960s, has been replaced by a permanently elevated water table that keeps the foundations of the temple perpetually damp. This moisture migrates upward through the porous sandstone by capillary action, carrying dissolved salts that crystallize near the surface as the water evaporates. The crystals expand as they form, fracturing the stone from within, a process so insidious that it can destroy a carved surface in decades while leaving the underlying block apparently intact. The restoration campaign that began in the 21st century at the Hypostyle Hall has addressed this problem with a combination of drainage, desalination, and surface consolidation. Workers have removed centuries of accumulated grime from the column surfaces, revealing original pigments, blues, reds, yellows, greens, that had been invisible for generations. The cleaned columns now show traces of their original painted decoration, hieroglyphs in full colour, figures of gods and kings outlined in vivid pigment, astronomical scenes on the undersides of the architraves. The restoration has been a revelation, showing visitors, for the first time in modern history, what the Hypostyle Hall actually looked like when it was new. But the restoration has also revealed the extent of the damage. Many surfaces, once cleaned, show the scars of salt weathering, pitting, flaking, and the loss of carved detail that cannot be recovered. The restoration preserves what remains. It cannot restore what is gone. And the ongoing exposure of the cleaned surfaces to the Egyptian climate, the intense heat, the occasional rain, the daily thermal cycling that causes the stone to expand and contract, means that the restoration is a holding action, not a cure. The decay continues. The restoration slows it, but it does not stop it. The scale of the conservation challenge is immense. The Karnak complex contains an estimated 50,000 carved and inscribed blocks, each one a potential target for salt weathering, each one requiring individual assessment, each one representing a piece of a 2,000-year documentary record that cannot be reproduced if lost. The resources available for conservation, while significant by the standards of Egyptian archaeology, are minuscule relative to the scale of the problem. The Centre Franco-Egyptian and its partners have conserved a fraction of the complex. The rest waits, exposed to the elements, deteriorating at a rate that is measurable but not stoppable, losing information with each passing year. And the information being lost is irreplaceable. The reliefs at Karnak are not decorative. They are documentary, records of military campaigns, religious rituals, diplomatic negotiations, and economic transactions that exist nowhere else. The text of the Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty, carved on the south exterior wall of the Hypostyle Hall, is one of the most important documents in the history of international relations. The battle scenes of Seti I, carved on the north exterior wall, are among the most detailed visual records of ancient warfare. The festival calendars, inscribed on the walls of the festival hall, provide our most complete account of the Egyptian religious year. Each of these records is carved in sandstone. Each is subject to salt weathering. Each is losing legibility with each passing decade. The Digital Karnak project, based at the University of California, has created a three-dimensional digital model of the temple complex that preserves the current state of the architecture in virtual form. The model, available online, allows users to navigate the temple, examine individual structures, and visualize the construction sequence, seeing how the temple grew, pylon by pylon, hall by hall, from the Middle Kingdom to the Roman period. The project is a remarkable achievement, a digital archive of one of the world's most important archaeological sites. But digital archives, as the mastabas remind us, are not permanent. They depend on servers, software, funding, and institutional support. The stone at Karnak is deteriorating, but it will outlast any digital archive by orders of magnitude. This tension between the fragility of the physical monument and the impermanence of the digital record is the conservation paradox of the 21st century. We have the technology to document Karnak more completely than any previous generation could. We can photograph every surface, scan every block, model every column. But the documentation is more fragile than the monument it records. The sandstone will outlast the server. The inscription will outlast the database. And the irony that our most advanced technology produces records less durable than the ancient stone they document would not have been lost on the priests of Amun who chose stone over papyrus for precisely this reason. The priests were right. Stone lasts, papyrus does not. And digital data, which is even less durable than papyrus, does not last either. The only permanent archive at Karnak is the stone itself, the carved and inscribed surfaces that have been accumulating information for 4,000 years. Those surfaces are deteriorating. They are losing information, but they are losing it slowly, over centuries and millennia, not over decades. And the information they retain, however degraded, however fragmented, however difficult to read, is still there, still carved in stone, still accessible to anyone with eyes and a knowledge of hieroglyphs, still speaking, in the language of the pharaohs, from the walls of the largest religious complex in human history. The modern world has nothing comparable. No building we have constructed contains information that will still be readable in 4,000 years. No archive we have created will survive the failure of the institutions that maintain it. No technology we have invented has a demonstrated lifespan that approaches the lifespan of carved sandstone in a dry climate. The priests of Amun at Karnak were not scientists. They were not futurists. They were not technology strategists. But they understood something that we have forgotten, that the most durable information is the information that requires the least infrastructure to read. A carved wall needs no power. A painted relief needs no software. A hieroglyphic inscription needs no internet connection. The medium is the stone, the message is the carving, and both endure. We have traded durability for convenience. We have traded permanence for speed. We have traded the slow, difficult, expensive process of carving information into stone for the fast, easy, cheap process of encoding information in magnetic fields on spinning disks. And the trade, while enormously productive in the short term, may prove catastrophic in the long term, because the spinning disks will stop spinning, the magnetic fields will decay, the encoded information will become unreadable, and the stone at Karnak will still be there, still bearing its inscriptions, still telling its stories, still documenting 2,000 years of human civilization in a medium that has already lasted 4,000 years and shows every sign of lasting 4,000 more. And beyond the immediate conservation challenges, Karnak faces a deeper existential question. What does it mean to preserve a monument whose purpose has been extinguished? Conservation can maintain the physical fabric of the temple. It can stabilize the columns, reinforce the walls, protect the painted surfaces, and prevent further structural collapse. But conservation cannot restore the temple's function. It cannot bring back the priests. It cannot resume the daily ritual. It cannot refill the sacred lake with holy water, or relight the torches in the Hypostyle Hall, or replace the golden statue of Amun-Ra in his granite shrine. Karnak today is a monument to something that no longer exists. It is the shell of an institution that has been dead for 17 centuries. And the shell, however magnificently preserved, is not the institution. The columns are not the chanting. The reliefs are not the rituals. The sacred lake is not the purification bath. The physical form survives. The experiential reality does not. This distinction between form and function is crucial for understanding what Karnak means in the modern world. We visit Karnak as tourists, as scholars, as pilgrims to the altar of human achievement. We admire the architecture, we study the inscriptions, we photograph the columns, but we do not experience the temple as the priests experienced it. We do not enter the Hypostyle Hall in torchlit darkness, carrying the bark of the god, chanting hymns to Amun-Ra, feeling the weight of cosmic responsibility on our shoulders. We see the building. We do not feel the belief. And the belief was the whole point. The transformation of Karnak from active temple to passive monument has been gradual. It began with the Christian closure in the 4th century. It accelerated during the Islamic period, when the temple was used as a quarry and a residential site. It entered a new phase with the arrival of European archaeologists in the 19th century, who treated the temple as an object of scientific study rather than a place of worship. And it reached its current state in the 20th century, when Karnak became one of the most visited tourist attractions in Egypt. Its ancient rituals replaced by the modern rituals of ticketing, guided tours, and souvenir shops. Each of these phases has preserved the physical monument while further distancing it from its original function. The Christian closure extinguished the priesthood. The Islamic period repurposed the structures. The archaeological period documented the remains. The tourist period commodified the experience. At each stage, the temple survived. At each stage, the temple became less of what it was and more of what we have made it. And what we have made it is a museum, an open-air museum certainly, a spectacular one, but a museum nonetheless. A place where the past is displayed but not inhabited, where the artifacts are preserved but the context is gone, where the visitor observes but does not participate, where the columns stand in the sunlight, stripped of their darkness, emptied of their purpose, beautiful and mute. There is nothing wrong with museums. Museums preserve, museums educate, museums connect the present to the past. But a museum is not a temple. A museum does not claim to house a god. A museum does not claim to sustain the cosmic order. A museum does not claim to stand at the center of the universe. Karnak claimed all of these things, and it claimed them not as metaphors but as facts. The god lived here. The cosmos was sustained here. The universe was centered here. These were not poetic assertions. They were operational beliefs. And the loss of those beliefs is the loss that conservation cannot address. The stones can be saved. The belief cannot be restored. And the gap between the two is the gap that defines every ancient religious site in the modern world. We can preserve the form. We cannot resurrect the faith. We can maintain the building. We cannot revive the institution. And the building, without the institution, is a magnificent but incomplete thing. A body without a soul. A house without an occupant. A temple without a god. Karnak is all of these things. And standing within its walls, surrounded by 200 acres of stone, that was built to house the creator of the universe, one cannot help but feel the weight of what is missing. Not the gold that was looted, not the statues that were buried, not the obelisks that were carried to distant cities. What is missing is simpler and more devastating than any of those things. What is missing is the sound of chanting, the sound of sandals on stone floors, the sound of the golden bark being lifted onto the shoulders of the priests, the sound of the hymn to Amun-Ra, sung at dawn, in darkness, in the presence of the god, in the greatest temple ever built by human hands. That sound has been silent for 1700 years, and the silence, filling the hypostyle hall from floor to ceiling, from column to column, from pylon to pylon, is the truest thing about Karnak today. Not the stone, not the reliefs, not the painted traces on the column capitals, the enormous, echoing, architectural silence of a place that was built for sound and has been empty of it for longer than many civilizations have existed. The silence is what you hear when you stand in Karnak at dawn, before the tourists arrive, when the only sound is the wind moving between the columns and the distant call of birds over the sacred lake. It is the sound of absence, the sound of 20 centuries of human devotion, compressed into stone and then released into the air when the last priest walked away. Listen for it. It is the only offering Karnak still accepts. And the Nile itself, the river that made Karnak possible, the river whose annual flood replenished the agricultural estates that funded the temple, the river whose waters filled the sacred lake and sustained the city of Thebes, played a role in the temple's theology that went beyond economics. The Nile was, in Egyptian understanding, a divine force, the manifestation of the god Hapi, who controlled the flood and determined whether Egypt would prosper or starve. The annual inundation was not a natural event, it was a sacred one. And the temples that lined the Nile's banks, Karnak on the east, the mortuary temples on the west, were positioned to participate in the river's divine cycle. Karnak sat on the east bank, the side of the living, the side of the rising sun. The mortuary temples, the Ramesseum, the temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari, the Colossi of Memnon, sat on the west bank, the side of the dead, the side of the setting sun. The Nile flowed between them, a liquid boundary between life and death, between the temporal and the eternal. And the rituals performed at Karnak were designed to bridge that boundary, to send offerings across the river to the dead, to invite the gods from the west bank to visit the east, to maintain the cosmic circulation that kept the universe in motion. The Festival of the Beautiful Meeting, celebrated annually at Karnak, involved the transport of the statue of Hathor from her temple at Dendera, more than 60 kilometers upriver, to Karnak, where she was reunited with Amun in a sacred marriage that symbolized the renewal of creation. The journey took several days by river. The statue was carried on a sacred bark, a golden boat, ornately decorated, borne on the waters of the Nile by a flotilla of priestly vessels. The arrival of Hathor at Karnak was a moment of great celebration. Music, dancing, feasting, and the distribution of food and beer to the populace. The festival reinforced the theological connection between Karnak and the broader network of Egyptian temples, a network that spanned the entire length of the Nile, from the delta to Nubia, each temple serving a specific god, each god playing a specific role in the cosmic order. Karnak was the hub of this network. Not every temple was connected to Karnak directly, but every major temple was connected to Amun-Ra, and Amun-Ra's home was Karnak. The theological primacy of the temple meant that what happened at Karnak affected the entire religious system. When Akhenaten closed Karnak, the entire system shuddered. When the temple was restored after Akhenaten's death, the entire system revived. Karnak was not merely the largest temple, it was the central node, the point through which the divine energy of the Egyptian cosmos was channeled, regulated, and distributed. The destruction of that node, the closure of the temple, the dispersal of the priesthood, the cessation of the rituals, was therefore not merely a local event, it was a cosmic one, in the theological framework that had governed Egyptian life for 3 millennia. The closure of Karnak was the equivalent of shutting down the sun. The cosmic order, maintained by 2,000 years of continuous ritual, was abandoned. The balance of Mat, the Egyptian concept of truth, justice, and cosmic harmony, was disrupted, and the world, deprived of the rituals that sustained it, should have collapsed into chaos. It did not, of course. The world continued, the sun continued to rise, the Nile continued to flood, the crops continued to grow, and the absence of the temple's rituals went entirely unnoticed by the cosmos, proving, in the most empirical way possible, that the temple's theological claims were wrong. The rituals did not sustain the universe. The god did not require feeding. The cosmic order did not depend on a granite shrine in Thebes. The 2,000 years of morning rituals, 730,000 prostrations, 730,000 broken seals, 730,000 offerings of bread and beer, had been performed in service of a theology that was, from the perspective of physical reality, unnecessary. But from the perspective of human meaning, the rituals were not unnecessary. They were the architecture of belief, the daily practice through which the priests, the pharaohs, and the people of Egypt made sense of their world. The rituals gave order to time. They gave purpose to labor. They gave meaning to power. They gave structure to society. And when they ended, when the last seal was broken and the last offering was made and the last hymn was chanted, something was lost that no new religion, no new philosophy, no new system of meaning could fully replace. Not the cosmic order, the human order, the sense of being part of something larger than oneself, of participating in a practice that connected the individual to the divine, the present to the past, the living to the dead. That loss is what you feel at Karnak, not the loss of a god, not the loss of a theology, the loss of a practice, of a daily, mundane, repetitive, beautiful practice that gave meaning to 2,000 years of human existence. The morning ritual was not grand, it was simple. A priest, a shrine, an offering of bread, but it was performed every day without exception for 2,000 years. And the accumulation of those 2,000 years of daily practice, the sheer weight of human attention directed at a single point, a single room, a single golden statue in a granite shrine, is what made Karnak sacred. Not the stone, not the gold, not the theology, the attention, the practice, the daily, humble, persistent act of showing up. The stone remains, the practice is gone, and the silence that fills the Hypostyle Hall at dawn, before the tourists arrive, before the guides begin their lectures, before the cameras start clicking, is the silence of 730,000 mornings that will never be repeated. Stand at the edge of the sacred lake at Karnak, just before sunset. The water is still. The reflections of the surrounding walls and columns shimmer on the surface. The lake, roughly 120 meters long and 77 meters wide, was used for ritual purification. The priests of Amun bathed here each morning before entering the sanctuary to perform the daily rites. The water was sacred. The lake was the primordial ocean, the waters of chaos from which the first land had emerged. Bathing in the sacred lake was not hygiene. It was theology, a daily reenactment of creation, a daily renewal of the cosmic order. The lake is still full, the water still reflects, but the priests are gone, the rituals are gone, the theology is gone. The lake is now a picturesque feature in an archaeological park, a nice place to sit and rest between the Hypostyle Hall and the ticket office. Tourists photograph their reflections in it. Guides mention it in passing. And the water, which was once the most sacred substance at Karnak, the primordial ocean, the source of all existence, is now just water. This transformation, from sacred to scenic, is the condition of every ancient religious site that has outlived its religion. Stonehenge, the Parthenon, the temples of Angkor, the pyramids of Teotihuacan, all of them have undergone the same transition, from active sacred spaces to passive tourist attractions. The transformation is not destructive. It preserves the physical site, but it erases the experiential dimension, the feeling of being in a sacred space, the sense that the stone and the water and the light are charged with meaning, the awareness that you are standing in the presence of the divine. Karnak's transformation is especially poignant because of the temple's sheer duration. 2,000 years of continuous sacred use, longer than any Christian cathedral, longer than any Islamic mosque, longer than any Buddhist monastery, ended not in a catastrophe but in a bureaucratic decree. An emperor signed an order, the priests obeyed, and 2 millennia of worship ceased. The fragility of that transition, the ease with which 2,000 years of accumulated sacredness can be erased by a single political decision, is the most unsettling implication of Karnak's story. We tend to assume that ancient institutions are strong, that their longevity implies resilience, that anything that has lasted 2,000 years must be nearly indestructible. Karnak proves otherwise. The temple lasted 2,000 years, not because it was indestructible, but because the political conditions that sustained it remained stable. When those conditions changed, when the Roman state adopted Christianity and withdrew its support for pagan worship, the temple collapsed in a generation. The stone survived, the institution did not. Longevity is not resilience, duration is not permanence, and 2,000 years of continuous operation can end in 2 decades of neglect. This has implications for our own institutions. We assume that our libraries, our universities, our museums, our digital archives will endure because they have endured so far, because they have survived previous challenges and emerged intact. Karnak's priests probably made the same assumption. They had survived the Hyksos invasion. They had survived Akhenaten's revolution. They had survived Assyrian and Persian conquests. They had survived 2,000 years of political upheaval, foreign rule, and theological challenge. They had every reason to believe that their institution was permanent. It was not, and ours may not be either. The institutions we have built, the universities that store our knowledge, the archives that preserve our records, the museums that protect our artifacts, are no more permanent than the priesthood of Amun at Karnak. They depend on funding, on political support, on cultural relevance. Remove any one of these and the institution falters. Remove all of them and the institution dies. And the building, the physical structure, the stone or concrete or steel, survives, empty and purposeless, a monument to something that no longer exists. Karnak is that monument. It is the largest religious building ever constructed. It is also the largest religious building ever abandoned. And it stands, in the Egyptian sun, as a permanent reminder that buildings and beliefs are different kinds of things, that buildings last because they are made of stone, and beliefs last only as long as people believe them. And the Sphinx Avenue, the 3-kilometer processional road restored and reopened in 2021, offers a physical connection between Karnak and Luxor Temple that is now, for the first time in 2,000 years, walkable. The avenue, lined with hundreds of restored ram-headed and human-headed sphinxes, crosses modern Luxor, cutting through streets, past shops, around mosques, over ancient foundations. Walking the avenue is a surreal experience. Ancient stone sphinxes, standing amid modern traffic, the processional route of Amun-Ra threading through a 21st century city. The reopening of the avenue was a major cultural event, attended by Egyptian officials, international dignitaries, and millions of television viewers. The ceremony, which reenacted elements of the ancient Opet festival, was designed to demonstrate the continuity between ancient and modern Egypt, to assert that the temple and the city, the past and the present, are not separate worlds but parts of a single story. The claim is arguable, but the avenue itself is not. It is there. It is real. It is ancient stone, restored by modern hands, standing in a modern city, connecting 2 temples that were built to be connected, and the connection matters. Karnak and Luxor Temple were not independent structures. They were 2 poles of a single theological system. Karnak, the home of Amun-Ra in his cosmic aspect, and Luxor Temple, the home of Amun-Ra in his earthly aspect. The Opet festival linked the 2 poles, carrying the god from his cosmic home to his earthly one and back again, renewing the connection between heaven and earth, between the divine and the human, between the eternal and the temporal. The avenue was the artery through which that connection flowed, and the restoration of the avenue, however incomplete, however compromised by the modern city that has grown around it, restores something of that connection. Not theologically, not spiritually, but physically. The path is open, the sphinxes stand guard, and anyone who walks the 3 kilometers from Karnak to Luxor Temple walks the same route that the priests of Amun walked 3,000 years ago. That is not nothing. That is something. That is the closest thing to resurrection that a dead temple can achieve. Not the return of the god, but the reopening of the road. Not the restoration of the faith, but the recovery of the form. Not the sound of hymns, but the sight of sphinxes. The avenue is not the festival, but it is the memory of the festival. And memory, at Karnak, is the only form of immortality that remains. So what is Karnak? It is the largest religious complex in human history. It is the work of 30 pharaohs across 20 centuries. It covers 200 acres. It contains the Great Hypostyle Hall, with its 134 columns. It contains the sacred lake, the avenue of sphinxes, 10 monumental pylons, and the buried remains of more than 17,000 statues. It is dedicated to Amun-Ra, king of the gods, whose worship at this site began around 2055 BC and ended around 323 of the Common Era. It is also a warning about the fragility of institutions, about the impermanence of faith, about the illusion of permanence that comes from building in stone. The pharaohs who built Karnak believed they were building for eternity. And in a physical sense, they succeeded. The stone has lasted. But the institution that gave the stone its meaning has not lasted. The priesthood is gone. The rituals are gone. The theological framework that made Karnak the center of the universe is gone. What remains is architecture, beautiful, overwhelming, silent architecture, and the knowledge that even the mightiest religious institution in history could be ended by a decree. Karnak answers its own title question. Why is it the largest religious complex in history? Because each pharaoh for 20 consecutive centuries added to it, and none of them subtracted. The ratchet turned. The temple grew, the institution accumulated power, and the accumulation, which seemed like strength, was actually vulnerability, because the larger the temple became, the more it depended on the political system that sustained it. When that system changed, when Christianity replaced the old gods, Karnak's size became irrelevant. 200 acres of stone could not save a single believer. The temple still stands. The columns still rise. The reliefs still tell their stories, of gods and kings, of battles and offerings, of a civilization that believed it had built the home of the creator of the universe. And the sacred lake still holds its water, still, clear, reflecting the sky and the stone, waiting for priests who will never return. Visit Karnak at dawn when the tourist crowds have not yet arrived and the light comes low across the Nile. Stand in the Hypostyle Hall, let the columns close around you, feel the darkness and the weight, and listen, not for the chanting of priests or the echo of hymns. Listen for the silence, the specific, dense, architectural silence of a place that was full for 2,000 years and has been empty for 1,700. A silence that is not absence. A silence that is the residue of everything that was once here and is now gone. That silence is Karnak's final offering. Not gold, not incense, not grain or wine or the blood of sacred bulls. Just silence. The silence of the largest religious complex in human history. The silence of the house of the king of the gods. The silence of a temple that outlasted its god. The columns stand. The sun rises, and the silence endures.